Yogah Karmasu Kaushalam.
Language teaching through literature in Indian classrooms must be based on learner-centered teaching. And this is the premise with which I will begin this module. Learner-centered teaching is an approach to teaching that focuses on student learning rather than on what the teacher is doing. Learner-centered teaching is not one specific teaching method, but rather a combination of many different instructional techniques. Some facts to help learner-centered teaching are as follows. Courses can be learner-centered without sacrificing content and rigor. There are many different ways to implement learner-centered teaching. Easier and more practical to make changes in one area at a time or make small changes. Learner-centered teaching is very effective. Students of learner-centered programs know why they need to learn, how they need to learn, and what they need to learn. They have a self-awareness of their learning abilities and their process. The process of gaining this learning ability, the process of achieving this outcome. The students are responsible. The students in this case can retrieve and evaluate information. They can use knowledge to solve problems. They can communicate their knowledge in real settings. According to WEIMER, there are 5 practices or dimensions that need to change to achieve learner-centered teaching. These are number 1, the functions of content, number 2, the role of the instructor, number 3, the responsibility for learning, number 4, the processes and purposes of assessment, and finally, number 5, the balance of power. Let us first talk about the function of content. In addition to building a knowledge base, the content facilitates students to build an appreciation for the value of the content, to build discipline-specific learning methodologies, to practice using inquiry or ways of thinking in the discipline, to learn to solve real problems, to engage in most of the content and make it their own so that they can create meaning out of the content. Content can help students to develop an organizing framework or a way to learn in the discipline of language. The content is framed so that students see how it can be applied in the future. Now we come to the role of the instructor. The instructor is responsible for creating an environment that fosters student learning, that accommodates different learning styles, that explicitly aligns objectives, teaching methods, and assessments consistently, that utilizes multiple teaching techniques appropriate for student learning goals, that designs activities in which students interact with the material, the teacher, and with each other. A student can be motivated to learn intrinsically. Now we come to the question of who should take the responsibility for learning. The answer is the students should. Usually it is us, the faculty, who do this because we adapt our teaching to fit the requests or the needs of the students through detailed notes, study guides, etc. The consequence of faculty taking responsibility for learning is that the students will remain passive. The students will never gain the confidence in their ability to learn on their own. It is a common goal of higher education, and it is very important for graduates to be self-directed learners. And this is how they can continue with lifelong learning. So my request or my suggestion is that make changes in your teaching by either selecting one component or one dimension to focus on, or to form small groups of people working on the same dimension. And faculty must know and accept the advantages of the learner-centered approaches to teaching before they can actually change their teaching. So, with an understanding of learner-centric teaching, we can move more effectively, more holistically towards teaching literature, but in a way that we are actually enhancing the acquisition of language through literature. So, in the next part of my presentation, I will talk about the effective strategies for teaching language through literature. And these may differ from classroom to classroom depending on the student's familiarity with the language as well as upon the proficiency of the teacher. One such technique is the fragmentation of text. What is the fragmentation of text? It is a method in which we take a text, a composite whole text, and we break it up into small sections. So we have a long piece of literature broken up into small sections, leading to a disintegration of the structure of a text. This is a kind of piecing, and this allows for multiple close readings to ensure that the students start thinking on their own. With repeated reading, the students understand better, and then they will become more comfortable with the writing style of an author. A case in point may be the essays of Francis Bacon. If you repeatedly read Francis Bacon, you can understand his wisdom, you can understand his logic, you can understand his prose style, you can understand all the logical premises he's building up, and as well as we can understand the aphorism. So this repeated reading of a fragmented text helps the students build better critical analysis about the writing style of an author. To help the students focus as they are reading, the teachers must provide a list of questions for students to answer. Surface level questions that can explicitly connect to the reading, as well as the insightful and analytical questions having answers that may be more open-ended and fluid. Asking questions that do not have a single and fixed or correct answer generates meaningful discussions and invites student perspective on the text. This builds up the confidence of the students and enhances their perspicacity. Another technique is facilitating group discussions in classrooms. When we have methods of teaching language through literature, can also include facilitating classroom discussions among student groups where each group of students may have their own responses to the reading of a particular text or a type of text. They may be often mentally inattentive to reading cum analysis by the teacher in a language or a literature class, because this can be monotonous, this can be one way, this can be non-interactive. But the moment we give them a piece of text and we involve the students in discussion while giving them both attention and credit, accepting their responses and laying it open for the rest of the class, this gives back the responsibility of learning in the hands of the students. To ensure complete student participation, the class must be divided into groups, and then they can be asked to discuss challenging questions. At the end of the small group discussions, which must be moderated by the teacher, the entire class can be gathered together, and one spokesperson from each group should report the conclusions made by that group, while at the same time inviting feedback and question from other groups. The entire class benefits from hearing multiple perspectives in a class discussion, and the teacher can also be enriched by the multiplicity and the plethora of points of view that emerge. Yet another way of teaching language through literature is by creating graphic organizers for analysis. What do I mean by graphic organizers? Students should be given a literary passage, asked to read it, and be enabled to understand it. Then they should be encouraged to create and maintain graphic organizers or charts and tables with headings like speaker, situation, sentences, shifts, and syntax. The teacher should guide them by defining each heading and explain how they can record their observations and interpretations for each heading of the graphic organizer using proof or extracts from the text for substantiation. For example, in the syntax section, students can record examples from the reading in which the word order seemed different, special, or even significant. Students should then be directed to analyze or to comment on how the syntax impacted the overall meaning of the passage. Because as Bacon says, studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. So this tripartite syntax, this choice of words, is it useful? Is there a difference in layers of meaning? Is there a structure followed? Is there a logic and a coherence? If so, what is it? The same can be followed for each of the headings given for identification and subsequent analysis. There are various types of reading for understanding language through literature, and we must be aware that any linguistic understanding of literature depends upon how thoroughly the literary passage is read. It may be by a superficial comprehension or an in-depth comprehension. Reading is a complex skill which involves a number of operations which may occur or proceed simultaneously. A student who has acquired the skills of comprehending written matter will invariably have the ability to do the following. He will be able to read a passage at an average or normal speed. He will be able to understand the structured and lexical meanings of the words, phrases, and sentences used in the passage. He will be able to read aloud with correct pronunciation, accent, stress, and intonation. He will be able to make an accurate conjecture about the meaning of an unknown word from the context in which it is used. He will be able to independently consult a dictionary to find out the meaning of an unfamiliar word if the contextual conjecture is incorrect. He will be able to find the required information by skimming through the entire page of the passage. He will also be able to read silently without moving the lips, with a balanced eye movement while reading, and he will be able to retain at the same rate. He will be able to identify the key sentence of the entire literary passage and of every paragraph, to make a summary of all the important points in the passage after reading and comprehension, to examine the text from the writer's point of view and infer the mood, opinion, style, and focus of the writer, to identify technicalities of writing such as punctuation, paragraph, indentation, sentence structure, syntax patterns, etc. He will also be able to identify and analyze the appropriateness of the figures of speech used by the writer and to illustrate their efficacy in enhancing the content or even detracting from it. So the process of reading literature and imbibing language while doing so can essentially be divided into three stages. They are, number one, the recognition stage, where the learner simply recognizes the graphic counterparts of the phonological terms. Here, The learner recognizes the spoken words in their written form. Number 2, the structuring stage, which is the stage where the learner sees the syntactic relationships of the items and understands the structural meaning of the syntactic units. Number 3, the interpretation stage, which is the highest level in the process of reading. The learner is now at a stage where he or she can comprehend the importance of a word, a phrase, a sentence, a clause, and can see beyond superficial connotations to an inner meaning of the implication of a statement. This is the ultimate goal to be attained in the process of reading. To achieve the aims and objectives of teaching language through literature, reading must be of two kinds: intensive reading and extensive reading. Intensive reading is a close reading technique where we read a text for accuracy. This can only be done with the guidance of the teacher, because the teacher will tell the learner to pay attention to the text, to the content, to the style, to the tone, to the structure, to even the movement of the text, whether it is linear, whether it is circular. So this involves a profound and detailed understanding of the text. This is primarily concerned with the developing of the reading and comprehension strategies, which are judgment, reasoning, interpretation, and appreciation. Intensive reading is more an exercise in accuracy because students do not read a text only for a specific purpose of information, but they also try to assess and analyze the impact on the reader of a writer's intentions, arguments, ideas, style, etc. Extensive reading or reading for fluency involves the reading of longer texts for pleasure, and it may be both speedy and cursory. It may not notice and examine the finer points of the writing and the minute details. It is a leisurely and independent activity in which the student is the autonomous reader and is not guided by any scholarly mentor or expert. He can read on his own, at his own time and his own pace. This is called rapid reading or independent and silent reading. The specific objectives of extensive reading are: number 1, to understand the meaning at a cursory glance; number 2, to increase passive vocabulary; number 3, to develop a taste for reading; number 4, to develop the habit of reading for pleasure; number 5, to concentrate upon content rather than form. So the term extensive reading means to read silently and quickly. It trains the reader to understand the subject matter efficiently. It plays a vital role in the learning of a second or foreign language, and the students are made to read as much as possible, and the reading texts selected for them or by them are within their own linguistic competence. There are hardly any follow-up activities that demand academic engagement with the text, and so this creates interest among the learners. They learn to read faster without any external hindrance or any fear of consequences. So the steps that can be followed in any extensive reading are: number 1, it begins with an introduction in which the teacher gives a hint or the outline of the content of the passage, explains the difficult portions of vocabulary and grammar, and outlines the main topic, highlighting the difficult words and structures. Thereafter, the students begin their silent reading. They are urged to read quickly. After the reading is over, the teacher asks questions to test the students' understanding. These are general and typical questions and usually do not require in-depth analysis or focal attention on the details of the text. In extensive reading, if the students are not too interested in reading textbooks, they can always be asked to read magazines and newspapers. Now we come to creating classroom conditions for the teaching of language through literature. Teaching language through literature focuses on increasing the student's comprehension of a passage or literary form and establishing a personal connection to it. The key is to use a variety of strategies to keep the students interested and involved. The teacher should create conditions that will elicit the behavior desired from their class or from an individual student. So some of these techniques can include selection. How exactly should something be chosen to teach? The teacher must first either choose it or read it if it is prescribed. Once the piece is read, the teacher should frame his or her own response, own impression. Because if it is uninteresting to you, it will be uninteresting to your students. So the response is the key, and based on the response, an instructional design can be created. The educator can proceed to analyze and respond to the passage, so that better ways can be sought in which the perspective and linguistic components of the passage can be explained to the students based on a connection with their own life, experience, interests, age, etc. This will make the literature both appropriate and engaging. If the course has a flexible curriculum, the teacher can select. If the course does not have a flexible curriculum and there is a prescribed literature piece, then close reading before teaching the same is absolutely imperative, so that the teacher can ensure how to choose the correct and best suited instructional technique for greater instructional efficacy. The second way is reading. Students must be encouraged to read, reread, and reread. Repeated observation usually reveals nuances of interpretation that are ignored or overlooked in the first reading, and this must be done at the beginning of the course. First, the text must be observed as a page in a book, as a part of an extract. Then it must be examined. Then questions must be asked with who, what, when, where, how. Then students must be encouraged to notice patterns, connections, repetitions, contradictions, and thereafter they must be facilitated to question everything and explain the reason for the presence and even for the absence of certain stylistic elements as well as other elements in the text. Finally, the students must be allowed to discover the theme of the text. What has the author intended for the reader to understand? This discovery will enable the student to both generate stylistic analyses and also answer inferential questions in the correct language. For this, at the beginning of the course, the teachers must ensure that their students understand literary terminology. Students must know what are the elements of fiction, point of view, character, setting, plot, structure, theme, etc., and why are writers using them. Now, most textbooks explain these terms, and thus the students can easily be given a glossary about these concepts, then asked to identify and discuss them during class by using examples from the assigned readings. This is one way of engaging the student. Yet another way of creating a classroom condition is by writing. One of the best ways for students to increase comprehension of literature passages is to write about the story or the essay they have been given to read. They must either keep a journal during the course of the semester and brainstorm, list, or free write a paragraph immediately after completing the reading. Depending on the level of the class, the teacher can create a list of questions to enhance creative and critical thinking. asking students to write a continuation of a short story or an essay and imagining what will happen next will stimulate their total understanding and enhance their analytical skills. Alternately, making them rewrite the ending of a short story, choosing a point in the action and changing the direction of the plot can also enhance their creative abilities. For example, stories by James Joyce, Catherine Mansfield, H.E. Bates can be twisted, can be left open-ended, can be restructured, and the students can use their imagination and their linguistic proficiency while doing it. Teachers can also insist that the students change the gender, age, race, or sexual orientation of a character from a story. Let us say the boy in Araby, or even the boss in The Fly, or even the old lady, Mrs. Thurlow, in H.E. Bates's The Ox, or even for that matter Wilson in Mom's Lotus Eater, who dies of the beauty of the sight of Capri. So any one character can be taken and changed and the entire story rewritten around a selected episode. Teachers can also assign the students with a character and even write a letter to the author and tell them what they think of the story. Yet another method is discussion. Lecturing will always help students understand the content, but a discussion is superior to lecturing as it can engage the students more deeply and actively with the content. Because when we hear multiple points of view, when we hear multiple challenges, multiple dissensions, we comprehend the material deeper. And when the students discuss amidst peer groups, it enables them to see what they might have missed out. So during the class, the teachers must ask questions. They must also encourage the students to frame their own questions on the patterns of the questions asked by the teacher. Effective teaching involves asking appropriate questions at appropriate intervals and encouraging students to ask their own questions. So small group discussions also provide the very shy and diffident students opportunities to relate one-on-one. We can have a group of 10, we can give them a question to discuss, we can enhance linguistic confidence in the learner by asking him to express in the question and answer format for both direct and inferential question. Finally, we come to technology integration. If a teacher integrates technology into the teaching strategies by watching the film version, by showing a related video in class, by making the students read and write related blog posts, by viewing author broadcasts, reading their own work or commenting on it, by assigning students to make a film script or write a dialogue or a screenplay about the story or the theme of the literary passage, there is going to be a great enhancement in the linguistic skills through a literary source. When we come to the Indian classroom, most of the prescribed English syllabi at the higher education level have prescribed textbooks that contain different literature passages for detailed and non-detailed study. There are two kinds of literature passages. One is for comprehension and grammatical study, and the other is for literary analysis and critical interpretation. Now, the first type of literature specimen taught in nearly all language classrooms is the basic grammatical extract of what we call a comprehension passage. It seeks to test a student's understanding of the basic knowledge of a text and its related grammatical structures, vocabulary exercises, because these passages are extracts of larger works. They can be historical, narrative, scientific, fictional, biographical, journalistic, etc. Generally, these texts are meant to be read intensively in order to understand their content. the writer's intentions and perspectives, which are mostly done through comprehension questions given at the end of each of the texts. These questions can involve skimming, scanning, and other similar reading techniques to answer the assessment. So the students must be enabled to practice these skills so that they can write the correct answers within the allotted time. This kind of teaching is usually done through the lecture method, rendering the student as a passive listener. Some teachers say we do this because it saves time. We do this to ensure that all the students in a classroom enjoy a uniform learning experience, because teachers believe traditionally that students should first listen to the lecture for a general comprehension of the subject matter and then later scrutinize the texts for close reading and greater clarity of personal comprehension. However, since the process of learning varies considerably from student to student, many other educators remain skeptical whether these objectives can be accomplished in diverse classrooms where one universal method is used. The basic purpose of a literature passage is to help the student to understand number one, content, and number two, language, so that they can finally answer the questions given at the end of the passage or at the beginning of the passage. This will be possible when we provide opportunities to learners to read the passage silently on their own without any preconceived notions or pre-given interpretations. So in this case, the techniques of skimming and scanning should be learner-centric and learner-dependent, and the reading skills must be developed on the basis of relevance for teaching. So any passage which is meant for intensive reading must be taught in that way, and that meant for extensive reading must be taught in that way. The second type of literary passage or literary specimen taught in nearly all English language classrooms is the basic literary text in the form of a prose piece, or rather a prose extract. A prose extract may be either fictional literature or non-fictional literature. We all know that under fictional literature we include novels and short stories written in English. But under the ambit of non-fictional literature, we can have essays, monographs, autobiographies, biographies, articles, reports, theses, academic writing, etc. In both these cases, fictional and non-fictional prose, what is sought is the student's understanding of the basic knowledge of the text and its related stylistic patterns and usage of rhetorical figures. These literary texts should be read both intensively and extensively in order to understand their content, the writer's purpose, the writer's perspective, the layers of meanings, the use of rhetorical figures, the stylistic nuances, and the sentence structures incorporated by the writer. These issues can also be analyzed through various reading techniques to understand the language through literature. And for this purpose, the teacher will have to enable the students to first understand the language and then to identify the stylistic cum rhetorical figures. It has been customary with us to always exclusively employ the lecture method and mostly to address our students as passive listeners, but this, however, cannot be justified anymore. Definitely not on the grounds that the process of learning varies considerably. It is because the process of learning varies considerably and educators use one uniform method that teaching in the classroom remains ineffective in both English language and English literature. The basic purpose of teaching language through literature is to enable in the learners an accomplishment of several objectives, such as identification of various linguistic styles appropriate to various types of literature, comprehension of the content in language so that they are able to identify and analyze the multiplicity of meaning generated by the varied nuances and the subtleties of the language used. They must be able to summarize, analyze, explain the various stylistic features in a passage that constitute the essence of the theme or the thought. And this will only be possible when we provide opportunities of learner-centric reading, independent, silent reading, when we give them the space and flexibility to form impressions through a guided approach. Once this is done, language will be invigorated through literature. And in the present day, we need to revive interest, invigorate language, reinstate enthusiasm in our students, and this can be done by being flexible, innovative, and giving them the space and the time and the responsibility of actively participating in the classroom.